Thank you so much for being here. My name is Caroline Coward. I am the group supervisor of the library at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, right here in beautiful Pasadena. We are one of 10 NASA centers, and today I'm going to talk to you about open science. What is open science? How is the JPL library not only involved in open science, but leading open science on lab within NASA and around the world? It's a really exciting time to be in libraries and in information science. Anybody who says libraries are dying obviously hasn't been in one for the past, 35 years. So here's just a short summary of what I'm going to talk about. What librarian doesn't like a good table of contents? I'm going to talk about why open science. What's the point? What's the big deal? Open and fair initiatives. What's the difference between open science and fair data? Many of you are familiar with the acronym FAIR. We're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into that. We're going to talk about the data science activities and partnerships with the JPL library, how librarians are really heavily into data science as sort of a sister discipline to information science. We're going to focus on open access, which is one element of open science. Libraries have been involved in open access for decades, and I'm going to talk to you about what it is, why it's important to you, why you need to know about it. I'm also going to talk about our partnership with our Chief Knowledge Officer. The Knowledge Office, knowledge management, knowledge transfer is a huge initiative at NASA, one that's been developing for a couple of decades. And I have a wonderful working partnership with our Chief Knowledge Officer at JPL. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we do what we do. Knowledge management, knowledge transfer is tangential, but it's also related to open science. That's why I'm mentioning it. I'm also going to talk about my involvement with the NASA, the AGU Data Citation Community of Practice. This is an initiative that I started back in the pandemic project with the American Geophysical Union, and it has really taken off. I'm going to talk about why that's important to all of you. Also, NASA's Ethical AI Initiative. I'm the only librarian that I know involved in ethical and responsible AI, at least in NASA. I see it as a direct adjunct to information ethics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between those two. I'm also going to talk about the open science session at the American Geophysical Union Fall 2021 meeting. So all of this feeds into libraries and open science and why it's important. Just a little bit about JPL, if you're not familiar with where I work. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory started in 1936 as essentially a chemistry and rocket propulsion laboratory on the campus of Caltech, again, here in Pasadena. Led by Professor Theodore von Karman and a group of students and fans and enthusiasts and hangers-on. Remember, back in the 1930s, rockets were so new, they were still relatively considered science fiction. You know, Buck Rogers flying around in rockets, Ming the Merciless and all that. It wasn't a clandestine operation, but it wasn't, sort of the humanities or chemistry or mathematics, which were really heavily celebrated in the 1920s and 30s. Legend has it, now this is just lore, legend, spurious grain of salt, that the Chemistry and Rocket Propulsion Lab, they blew up a classroom on lab. Actually, I think it was a hallway or maybe it was a stair. They blew up something big on lab. And if you've ever been to Caltech, they have this beautiful Italianate neo-Renaissance architecture, just gorgeous. And the administration at Caltech said, Dr. von Karman, we love what you're doing. Please go do it someplace else. No more blowing up classrooms or hallways or staircases. So the group found this sort of empty wasteland called the Arroyo. There was nothing. It was on a terraced hillside, and they figured we can blow stuff up all we want, and we're good, right? So that's how JPL wound up in the location it is, just north of the Rose Bowl off of the 210 freeway. And if any of you have ever been to JPL during our open house or on a tour, you know that we're on a very steep hillside, and that's why. So we won't hurt anything. Through the years, the lab has really grown. We've added multiple buildings. During the Second World War, the Department of the Army took notice at what Dr. von Karman and his team were doing regarding jet engines. And remember, going into World War II, we had prop planes, propeller planes. And the US Army thought, this is a great thing for the war effort. We can attach these things to our airplanes and make them much faster and much more maneuverable. So JPL actually became part of the Army effort from 1943 to 1957. And in 1958, there was a momentous event all over the news. Something went into space that the US kind of got very jealous of. It was called Sputnik. The USSR beat us into low Earth orbit. So actually NACA and NASA, the very nascent NASA administration and agency, again, saw this potential in jets, and they thought, okay, if we just orient them instead of horizontal, if we orient them vertical, we've got a cheap, easy, consistent way of getting out of Earth's atmosphere. So JPL became part of NASA in 1958. We are NASA's only FFRDC. What's an FFRDC? It's a federally funded research and development center. FFRDCs are all over the federal government, lots of partnerships with different federal agencies, usually between either a private corporation or an educational institution such as Caltech. So if you see the Venn diagram, that's how we relate to Caltech. We are still essentially a rocketry and propulsion lab of Caltech, but NASA funds us, gives us our marching orders, if you will. Caltech provides the staff, NASA pays for the buildings. It's a real symbiotic relationship as governed by something called the prime contract. So that is NASA and JPL in a nutshell. This is me. I wasn't always a librarian. I was not born a librarian. I got my Master of Library and Information Science from San Jose State University in 1997. I was a child. My undergraduate degree is in music, cello performance. And I still play the cello. I'm in several symphony orchestras around town, Whittier, La Mirada, Bakersfield, the South Bay, you name it. It's sort of my right-brained escape. But about halfway through my schooling at Cal State Long Beach, which is where I went, I realized, I had an epiphany, that music, like crime, does not pay. And I had to get a job. I wasn't going to be the next member of the LA Philharmonic because I really didn't like to practice. I'd much rather be going to parties and hanging out with my friends. So I got a job in my local public library. I just happened to live down the street, and it clicked. I found I had a real affinity and an aptitude for connecting people with the information that they need. And I was a library assistant without the degree for 5 years, decided to go to library school, and there, 30 years later, it's a career, right? So I've worked for all types of libraries. I spent the majority of my time in higher education at Cal State Dominguez Hills in Carson, which is about 30 miles south of here. I've also worked at University of Southern California, Pasadena City College, the Sierra Madre Public Library, and the 20th Century Fox Studios Library. I became tenured faculty at Dominguez Hills back in 2009. And coordinating information literacy initiatives, high-impact practices, other types of initiatives. Left it all behind to become the head of the library at JPL in 2017. So I just celebrated my 5th anniversary last July, and I'm going to 6 years at JPL. Hopefully more. I'm having a ball. I get to work with very, very smart people every day. They challenge me. I have to bring my A game all the time, and it has raised my A game. It's been a really wonderful ride. Okay, so why are we all here? Open science. Why open science? What's the big deal? What's the point? So open science, in a nutshell, is making the product and process of federally funded research globally available. The catchphrase is as open as possible, as restricted as necessary. We're not talking about stripping away all security measures, but we want to make sure that federally funded, taxpayer-funded science is available to everybody who wants it, who needs it, who can use it, or who is just interested in it. So several initiatives have been brewing over the past several years. The White House, OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy, came out with a memo several months ago, essentially outlining the guidelines and rules and policies around open science, lifting restrictions, eliminating roadblocks, making sure that you and me as taxpayers can access these materials, the data sets, the software, the journal articles, et cetera, everything that is paid for through NASA and other government agencies. Oh, by the way, I have, I uploaded my slides to the SCALE website, and all these links are live. These are everything in red, so you can go later next weekend, 2 o'clock in the morning, just start clicking on links, and everything is live. So the SMD Open Source Science Initiative, SMD stands for Science Mission Directorate. So this is the agent or the office in NASA that coordinates, funds, organizes everything that flies, everything that all the Earth science satellites, heliophysics, astrophysics, everything, any kind of satellite, any kind of rocket, any kind of aviation research. The Science Mission Directorate coordinates all of that. They have come out with their open source science initiative, and their tenets are transparent, accessible, inclusive, and reproducible. And their statement on their website, open source science requires a culture shift to be more inclusive, transparent, collaborative, et cetera, which will increase the pace and quality of scientific progress. So what they're saying is opening up all of this information really benefits NASA, benefits researchers, benefits the entire world. Their community building effort, their wing of sort of outreach, training, communication is called TOPS, Transform to Open Science. And I've been involved in the TOPS initiative for about a year and a half. Among other things, they're developing a certificate and credentialing program for open science for university researchers primarily, but for any researcher who is interested in applying for NASA-funded projects. We have a threshold, we have some rules that now ask you to demonstrate how you do open science or how you plan to do open science with NASA's money. Not sure how to do that? Check out TOPS. They have a training program for that walks you through from theory to practice to application. It's a really wonderful program. Also, I mentioned the American Geophysical Union before, which is the world's largest earth and space science professional association. I got involved in AGU several years ago when I started at JPL because, to be perfectly honest, after 30 years in libraries, I'm kind of sick of library conferences, going to talk to people just like me about issues that I'm intimately familiar with, and I figured, I'm brand new at this space thing. I really need to get to know my users, my library patrons, and what better way than to start going to space conferences. So I became very, very involved with AGU. They have a wonderful data track, also an amazing DEIA track. If you're at all interested in equity, inclusion, diversity, check out AGU. They're really doing it right. They have a statement on open science, promoting unfettered communication of data, debates, findings, et cetera. So open science really is a global effort, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. There's funding available for it, there's training, there's all kinds of information. So it really behooves researchers around the world to at least check it out, if not take a deep dive into open science. NASA also declared this year, 2023, the year of open science. And again, these are all live links. I'm not going to read these to you. But for a variety of reasons, we're really focusing on open science this year. There was a big run-up last year. A number of other federal agencies are also partnering with NASA in the year of open science. We want to do this as a team across the federal government, so the messaging is clear and consistent, so the effort is clear and consistent, and so we're all kind of putting out the same information and sort of partnering with each other so that no one agency is far out, ahead of anyone else. So at the very bottom, those two links, SBD 41 and SBD 41A, are newly minted NASA policy regarding science initiatives. It stands for Science Policy Directive. So SBD 41, 41A talk about specific things like how to and why to release your data sets, how to lift embargo periods on journal articles, what types of software and code and tools need to be released along with your science or your journals. They really get down into the specifics of what researchers must do in order to be eligible, in order to be granted NASA funds for research. So I encourage you to check out those. If you're into reading government policy, those last two links are for you. Open and fair. So a lot of people conflate open science with fair data. You're like, what's the difference? They kind of do the same thing, right? They're bookends, but they are not two sides of a coin. There are some concrete differences. So open science, as I mentioned, is all about making the process and product of federally funded scientific research available. So that includes open access, which is unfettered access to journal articles. Instead of clicking on Springer or Wiley and having to pay $50 a pop for an article, open access means the PDF just opens. There it is. There's the article. You can download it. You can share it. Open data also is sharing openly of your data sets on a public repository. And this is something that was a challenge for JPL because with more and more emphasis on multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary science, especially from the various decadal surveys that are coming out, it became difficult for JPL researchers to place their data sets in domain or discipline-oriented or discipline-focused repositories. They were getting turned away from repositories because they were saying, you're not earth science-y enough, or you're not astrophysics-y enough, because they were inherently multidisciplinary. So at JPL, we figured, why not? We're going to make our own. So we're ending a 2.5-year process of creating our own in-house data repository based on the Dataverse open source platform from Harvard University, and we're very, very excited about that. Open code, open tools, similar idea, posting them publicly for everyone to see, for everyone to download your software so you can run the data sets, you can replicate the results from your research. FAIR data is a little bit different. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. What does all that mean? So findable, can you find the data set using a standard search engine or an in-house search engine? Accessible, once you find it, can you even see it? Can you download the data? Interoperable, how do you share the data across platforms, across users, or is it just kind of stuck in this one repository? Reusable, how can you repurpose that data set, possibly for your own uses? Not all data is fair, but there is a push to make data fair. What's the difference between fair and open? Just because you have a fair-oriented or a fair platformed data set, it doesn't mean it's open to the entire world. You can have FAIR data inside an organizational firewall that is open and reusable and interoperable within your own organization, but it's not necessarily open. Conversely, you can have an open data set that's available around the world, but that is neither reusable nor interoperable nor really accessible. And we were running into this a little bit when we were looking at the planetary data ecosystem, PDS Plus, so the world of planetary data, yes, was open, but it was very, very difficult to get into because the repositories were designed like labyrinths. Yeah, and there were dead links, and you had to email the repository owner for permission. So yeah, the data set was out there, but it was very, very difficult to find. So FAIR can be locked down in-house or open. Open can be FAIR or not FAIR. So there are definitely differences. I've talked a little bit about how to find these things. Search curation. We're involved, the JPL library is involved in search curation initiatives to make sure that our in-house data sets are findable by JPLers. We're heavily involved in data governance, data stewardship at JPL, and also semantic tools in information science, taxonomy development, knowledge graph and ontology, and metadata development. So the JPL library is really heavily involved in information science as well as library science. It's a really exciting time to be a librarian. Leading into some data science partnerships. When I started at JPL, I was handed the chairship of the ontology working group. And having come from 20 years in higher education leading information literacy initiatives, I didn't know what an ontology was. I'd never heard the word before. Don't tell my boss. But I learned very quickly what it was. I was able to kind of scaffold my learning and able to transfer some of the skills and techniques I had as an information scientist over to the data science realm. So I became a much more effective chair of the ontology working group. A couple of years later, I rebranded and renamed the group to the Semantic Technology Community of Practice because we were doing far more than just building ontologies. We were we were slipping into knowledge graphs, but we were also talking about taxonomy development, metadata, all kinds of things. So this is one partnership we have with our data scientists at JPL. Also includes data governance. Like I said, we're heavily involved in data governance. We mint DOIs. I talked about the new Dataverse platform at JPL. So the JPL library, bring us your data set and we'll mint you a DOI so that you have a persistent identifier for that data set. We've been doing that for about a year and a half. Data placement, as I mentioned, we were having difficulty working with Caltech, NASA, the different discipline repositories, so we decided to build our own, but my librarians are expert at working with data sets and loading them and communicating with data repository owners. We also started a JPL-wide data management plan template. We have various taxonomy initiatives. Taxonomy building is a service that we offer through the JPL library. I hired a taxonomy librarian to develop this service specifically. And I mentioned the JPL Open Repository. That's our acronym for Dataverse, is JOR. We have to have a TLA for everything. If you don't know what a TLA is, see me after the talk. Okay, so the JPL Open Repository, a little bit of a deep dive. Here's the URL. There is a public and an internal side so that we have both publicly hosted data sets and material and content. This is the old JPL TRS, the technical report server. So we just ported all of the documents from the TRS into Dataverse, and this is what we have now. Fair environment and foundation. We're doing open source, open tools, open access for all JPL authored papers, and a little bit about the history, why we went into this, and some of the features of the JPL Open Repository. I mentioned data storage. Dataverse is a wonderful platform. It does auto abstracting. So if you have a paper and you think, okay, we need to OCR this and get an abstract, the Dataverse will do that for you. It's a wonderful tool. and also auto-issues data, DOIs. And it has wonderful search capabilities, so you can bundle a journal article with a data set with the software that goes with the data in its own folder. So you do a text search, a natural language search, and it'll send you a folder of, hey, here's an article and here's everything else that goes with it, so you don't have to go hunting around the repository for all the materials. It's a great tool. I'm very, very happy about it. Open access. Okay, so what is open access? Librarians have been involved with the open access piece of open science for 20 years. So as soon as the majority of scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles became digitized and the majority of them available online as opposed to a paper journal, publishers began taking these behind paywalls. You had to either pay by the article or pay for an ongoing subscription to access journal articles. Most university libraries encumber that cost for either the pay by the drink or journal subscriptions, so that if you're affiliated with a university, you can just click on the link and you have immediate access to that journal article. But what was happening is that subscription costs were going higher and higher and higher, and university libraries were having to cancel a lot of their subscriptions, making it much more difficult for researchers on campus to access those articles. And so open access is a solution to that. What open access is, they remove the paywall, the publisher removes the paywall, they remove the roadblock to reading the article. So if you are a member of the general public and you are looking for an open access article, if you find one, the PDF link will just be live, and you will not be presented with the option to either pay $60 for the article or contact your campus librarian. Because if you're not affiliated with a university, you think, I don't have a campus librarian, and I really don't want to pay $60 for one article. Because if you're doing a literature review and you need 15, 20, 35 articles, that adds up to real money after a certain point. So open access is the ability to read articles without payment, without paywall. The problem is the publishers raised the publication charges. Researchers have to pay to get their stuff published, to get their articles published. They have to pay a fee to journal publishers, sometimes $1,500, $2,000. It can get very, very expensive. And if you want your article published as open access, that fee goes even higher. So it's a double-edged sword. It's great for the global researching public. Makes it more difficult for individual researchers because that money has to come out either out of your lab or out of your grant, how you're publishing. I could speak for hours on open access and journal publishing. Transformational agreements turned that kind of on its ear and built in these these publication charges into paying for the subscription costs. So instead of paying for publication charges by the drop or by the publication, the library or the institution is billed one large bill at the beginning of the year to cover all publication charges. The JPL library is pursuing joint subscription and joint access contracts with Caltech. We're kind of knocking down those dominoes one by one. In the past, our collections were separate because they came out of different pots of money. Our collections at JPL come out of NASA money. The Caltech collections come out of Caltech money. But we're finding ways to partner with Caltech so that everybody, both Caltech and JPL, has access to the same content. We also have a partnership on lab with our document review group. What document review does is make sure, essentially, that we're not releasing secrets to governments and people that we don't want to see them. They go through a clearance process. Every time we publish a journal article, document review has to take a look at the content of that article to look at the sort of the technology and the diagrams and the information that's going out to the general public. I had to get this talk cleared through document review so I could talk to you all today. We also talk about, we also have an open access week event with the Caltech library that usually draws a lot of people from both institutions. So that's what we're doing with open access. I'm going to kind of breeze through the next couple of slides. We do partner, with our Chief Knowledge Officer, talking about knowledge transfer and knowledge management. There are differences between what information scientists do and knowledge managers do, but we do have a very fruitful partnership with them, and we want to continue to grow that. As I mentioned at the outset, knowledge management is a bit tangential to open science, but it is definitely a growing part of open science. We started the Data Citation Community of Practice in January of 2021. So what is the frustration that this is solving? What we were finding is that citations to data sets in the professional literature were very, very difficult to find. And they were kind of buried, and people were calling these data sets different things when they published the articles. And this was a vexation to data managers and repository owners who have to report each citation to their stakeholders to really prove the value of their repositories. So we started this with a group of researchers, publishers, librarians from in and around AGU, and it's still going today to try and apply some kind of machine learning solution to finding and really teasing out citations to data sets within the professional literature. I mentioned ethical AI a little bit at the beginning. This is a real passion of mine because I see there's a real through line, a solid through line from ethical and responsible AI to information ethics. As a librarian, my acculturation and schooling is grounded in information ethics, patron privacy, access to information, quality of collection, et cetera. And because almost all of the information that we access, that we upload, goes through some kind of artificial intelligence filter, if not actually provided by artificial intelligence, hello ChatGPT, it is really beholden upon librarians, information professionals everywhere to take a look at ethical AI and responsible AI. So I've been on this road for about a year and a half, given a couple of papers, a couple of conference papers, one at COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, last summer in Athens, Greece. I'm very involved in the NASA effort and the AGU effort for ethical AI and responsible AI. If you want to know more about the difference between the two, I'm happy to talk with people after the talk about responsible and ethical AI. It's worth checking out. I briefly mentioned the NASA PDE IRB, Planetary Data Ecosystem Review Board. As I mentioned before, our planetary data was in several repositories, was kind of in different formats, very difficult to access, and so we tried to get our arms around this with a report to NASA from a couple of years ago, talking about how to better present our planetary data to the general public, how to make it easier to find, easier to access, easier to download, more fair, compliant. But it's not just planetary data, it's heliophysics data, it's earth science data, it's astrophysics data, it's all the divisions. So you can check out the final paper. Again, the links are live, but I'm very, very proud of the work that we did on this committee because I think it starts the conversation about how to structure open access and open science data so that the general public can access it. And then finally, we ran an open science panel or actually session, at the American Geophysical Union fall meeting in 2021 called Yes, We're Open, the Benefits of Fair Data and Open Science. We had a couple of spectacular keynotes. The former chief scientist of NASA, Dr. Jim Green, gave our open science keynote, and the chief executive officer of NISO, National Information Standards Organization, Todd Carpenter, gave our Fair Data keynote. Couldn't be prouder of this whole effort, and that really got the ball rolling, and the conversation started across the broader AGU about open science. They've been involved in open science for a while, but we had 14 speakers, had very young publishers, diamond open access publishers. Happy to talk about the different flavors of open access with anybody here. So wrapping this up, why open science? Why are we doing all this? What's the point? At the end of the day, I have a couple of maybe self-serving reasons to do open science, but it really is all about broadening our reach, making federally funded material and science and the process and product of what we do available globally. And for me, this serves a couple of purposes. It makes current research more robust. It enhances the conversation. It drives science forward. But it also has the potential to inspire young researchers, high school kids, junior high kids who have never seen a data set before. They want to experiment with some open source tools or software, and they want access to NASA-authored journal articles. You can be a real inquisitive 14-year-old, you can be an inquisitive college student. If you're a K through 12 teacher who wants to use this data for a lesson plan, there's all kinds of reasons why open science is a really good thing. Another, I would say, a benefit of open science, it opens up the research process and the research product to underserved, underrepresented populations, researchers from the global south, researchers from countries where they don't have a space agency, or their science funding federally is not as well developed. This allows them to access everything that we're doing at NASA, everything we're doing in several federal agencies for no cost. It's just open. And so, again, it fosters the science around the world. And I'm I'm heartened to see where the next 10 years goes because of open science efforts. It also expands the scope of libraries. Again, this is a little self-serving. We're getting into data science, we're getting into knowledge management and computer science and being recognized for that. And it really breaks down barriers and raises the profile for not just the JPL library, but for engineering and science libraries and university libraries around the world. And at the end of the day, the very last bullet is what it's all about. We are able to serve our library users much more effectively. That's my talk. Thank you very much. Please keep in touch, and I'll take questions.
We have time for questions, if anybody would like to ask some.
We got a mic going around.
Great, thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. As a biologist who works with people at NASA who are mostly physical science folks, one of the issues that I have working with them is they often use MATLAB. This may be a question that you really don't care about, but they often will put their data out in MATLAB and make that is not necessarily compatible with Octave, which is sort of the free and open source version of MATLAB.
Okay.
Do you guys actually curate and check that code? Is that something that you guys do within JPL?
Yeah, well, so that's an ongoing conversation right now. Is the code data sets, who is responsible, especially in the clearance process? Who checks the accuracy? Who checks the veracity, where it's coming from, sort of the chain of custody, if you will. And what we have determined at JPL is really that's up to the line management. The researcher that produces that data set, the researcher that produces that code, who checks the quality? It's up to that person's supervisor, the person that is really most intimately involved with that researcher's work. So we're really leaving that up to the line management. We don't have any kind of external checking because a lot of the work we do is rather niche. It's pretty in the weeds, and it would be very, very difficult and really not super effective for us to find like a group of people that go around checking data sets or that go around checking MATLAB code, because only you know your research intimately, and hopefully you're having a conversation with your boss about what you're doing and your funding and your time and all that. So at JPL, we're leaving that to the line management.
You said we should ask you after the lecture about, fair AI or ethical AI? And
Yeah,
please speak.
ethical and responsible artificial intelligence, absolutely. So again, this is something I'm very, very passionate about. So ethical AI came about, the conversation started about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, because, well, we've all experienced unethical AI, right? Attempts to gather our own data, we're all being monetized, Big Brother, et cetera. And as an information scientist and as a librarian, I am very passionate about information ethics, making sure that the people that I work with, who I'm shepherding through the information process, have access to the highest quality, the best information possible. And if there is any kind of hitch, if there's any kind of problem or issue, I need to know about it as well as the library user. So I got involved in ethical AI from that standpoint, from information ethics. So there is a difference between ethical and responsible AI? Pardon? Oh, examples of...
What a failure of ethical AI would be and a failure of
Oh,
other kind of AI?
so a classic example is, so an artificial intelligence system loaded into, let's say, the healthcare or the medical care industry that is separating out patients for diagnosis and treatment that has either an unintentional glitch in the code or an intentional filter in the code that is making certain types of, or people with certain types of diseases or medical issues either either blocking them from treatment or making their treatment more expensive or shuttling them off to other hospitals, other medical clinics so they can't get timely treatment. That's a thing that's happening, is that providers of care, medical care and health care, especially in a profit-driven environment, I don't want to get too political or preachy here, but in a profit-driven environment, they want to expedite and raise profits to make sure that they're getting the most bang for their buck. So, so there are some inherent biases in artificial intelligence systems. Now, ethical AI is all about, yes, after the fact, ferreting out those biases, correcting those biases, but also being proactive, going in and saying, okay, when we develop this system, we are going to be as unbiased as possible. But also, this is a call to industry, because quite often we purchase these black box systems, and industry, they won't tell us how they developed their algorithm. Well, great example is Google. How does Google search work? They're not going to tell us. Librarians have been clamoring for that information for 30 years. And they, especially Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a bit of a conundrum, because how does Google determine what article or what content is scholarly? Well, Google has their own algorithm. Okay, what is it? They're not going to tell us. So it's that kind of black box mentality. And again, this is part of open science, is opening up that black box, opening up the process, opening up the product. Let's see your algorithm. Yes, I mean, we realize that there are some proprietary items in there, but at least share your process with us. So the healthcare industry, that's just one example. We are being monetized every time we go online. All kinds of, do you accept cookies? If you don't accept the cookies, you can't see this website. That's another, I would call that unethical. It's not open science or open sharing. Responsible AI is a much more global approach, or a much higher level approach, talking about who's involved in developing these systems? How are they being funded? What systems are they running on? Ethical AI is much more in the weeds, and it's all about the development of the system. Great question.
So here's a quick question. How are you combating AI hallucination, say, in these systems that often happens when you have large sources of code, AI tells you one thing, it's trained improperly. How exactly nuance? What's your take on that?
I'm sorry, it was a little hard to hear. Can you repeat the question a little bit louder?
So with AI, how is one combating AI hallucination when you're drawing from multiple sources or biased sources? How are you making sure to mitigate those bias in those sources as you go, and how to incorporate that later on to combat hallucination?
So as a librarian, what we are really working with is the product. The end result of these systems is the information has already been filtered through some kind of artificial intelligence or machine learning process. And so what we do is a lot of comparative research. We show the person we're working with, I'm going to call them the user, 5, 7, 10 different results, and we caution them and we say, okay, here are the sources that this is where we got the information from. Let's sit down and let's walk through the process together so you can see what search I did and how we got this information. You as the subject matter expert, because you've got the knowledge, you've got the science, we have the know-how in terms of finding the information. We can partner, and I can show you how I got to this, and if the results are a little bit different, and we can have a conversation about, well, why do you think they're different? And we can dig as deep as possible into these systems, into the back end. And this goes into the ethical AI question. How open are these systems? If they're not open, then it just remains a question. And you as the searcher, as the user, all I can say is, be your own best advocate, buyer beware, and you may want to gauge your information analysis based on a couple of sources, not just one. I hope that answers your question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Shifting gears a little bit away from AI, there's a couple of different ideas around repositories. So for instance, GitHub is a repository system where you're constantly refreshing and updating your code. Libraries tend to have published works where you're not going to, maybe you'll get a second edition of a book, but you might have the first edition of the book lying around. In your repositories, where does this stand? So if I gave you a piece of open hardware, and then I had an iteration on that piece of open hardware, is that a new repository? Is that a second version? Like, how are you handling that and the references that go around? Because like a reference may be only relevant to a previous version of the hardware.
Really good question. In fact, we just had this question come up in a meeting a couple of days ago. So for us at JPL, and again, I can only speak for JPL, the way we handle that is the nature, quality, and distinction of the change in the hardware. So from version 1, let's say we upload it to the repository, it's out there, you get a DOI, you get a digital object identifier, which is a persistent identifier to that version of the hardware or the tool or the code or the whatever. If you come to us a couple months, a year later and say, hey, we've made some updates, we have to have a conversation, because if it's a substantive change, something that fundamentally changes the way the process works or the outcome of, you run your data through some software, if you make tweaks to the software, if it changes the result, we're going to assign you another DOI. That persistent identifier only works for the first version of the hardware. If there's a substantive change that affects the outcome, we're going to assign you a different persistent identifier so that both of them are out there. You can put a disclaimer, you can put a README file saying, no, please use this one, don't use this one. But in the spirit of open science, that first version is also out there for people to look at.
Right. It sounds like, are you familiar with semantic versioning?
A little bit, yeah.
Because it sounds very similar. Anyway, other questions?
I was curious in terms of the work around knowledge management. what, if any, efforts are there around like telling the stories, like verbally, whether audio, video, behind all the work that's being done, both technical and also from like the personal narratives of those individuals?
Really good question. So there are a number of not only efforts, but schools of thought around this. One school of thought is in terms of what's called knowledge capture or knowledge transfer. When you have an employee who's leaving an organization, you want to make sure that their years of contacts and information, everything in their head, if you will, doesn't walk out the door with them, anything that would benefit the organization. So you can sit down with them and do an interview and transcribe the interview. You can video them, and you can do sort of an auto captioning so that people can do a search on the text of the caption. So that's kind of one way. You can capture their words. You can also have them, sort of write out answers to generally canned questions that the organization has come up with based on what they feel is important. Another really interesting school of thought, and something that JPL Library has been doing for many, many years, is storytelling. And storytelling involves someone with, let's say, 40 years experience at NASA. Just here's a topic or no topic, or just sit there and just start talking, because quite often our colleagues who've been around for 30, 40, 45 years are wonderful storytellers. You get them over a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, and they will talk your ear off. We want to capture that. We want to have a broader audience for that. And within that, there are two schools of thought: to record or not to record. Because knowing that there is a recording, a capture device in the room, often changes how someone will tell a story. They say it's not as spontaneous, it's not as organic as if you're just sitting across from them. So we've done it both ways. We've had the non-recording, we call it JPL stories, where we invite someone either who has retired or who is on the verge of retiring or who's just a really good storyteller. Just sit there with 15, 20 people in the audience and just spin yarns for an hour. We've also had a more intentional process where we give them a topic and they tell stories, again, from their own perspective, but we do capture that either on video or audio, and we do, like I said, we do transcripting. So it really, it changes the dynamic between the storyteller and the audience, whether there's a microphone on or not. Really good question.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.